Hello and welcome to Unleashed, the show that explores how to thrive as an independent professional. I'm your host, Will Bachman, and I'm excited to be here today with Spish Rurak, welcoming Spish back to the show. Spish is a noted advisor and consultant to consultants, helping them on their job search, works with many consultants from top-tier firms based in the UK. And Spish, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Will. Pleasure to be back. Thank you for having me.
So really appreciate you coming back, Spish, to talk about your experience, advising consultants who are doing job searches during the pandemic. And I understand that you did a little bit of additional research, reached out to some folks to help, get some insight for this show. Tell us a little bit about what you did there.
Yes, well, I didn't want to rely just on my observations on the margin or the periphery, so I actually reached out to a number of my clients and colleagues whom I know have been pursuing job searches during that pandemic to see what they experienced. So you're going to hear, as we talk, not only my own observations and opinions, but let's say a distillation of the answers and observations of about let's call it almost 20 individuals who were in the job market during the past year.
Fantastic. What, maybe we could start with some high-level observations that you have based on your own experience as well as from the folks that you reached out to. Probably a lot of things are similar during the job search during the pandemic of doing a job search. What do you see as some of the differences?
There are differences, Will, but I would say that they're not as significant as many of us would expect or think. The pandemic's, manifold, often catastrophic consequences on our societies, economies, and individual lives hasn't actually worked itself out as much in the talent markets that I think are relevant to the audience that is going to be listening to this. It's not a crisis like what the U.S. experienced after 9/11 or what we have seen globally, the financial meltdowns of 2007 and 2008. I would characterize the consequences of the pandemic for job searching as and I use this advisedly, a procedural aberration. We're talking of changes that are, let's say, in the 5 to 15% category, not 20 to 40%, with one exception I will mention later. Nonetheless, it's, I think, very valuable for us to talk about this because however comparatively small these changes may be, they can be significant on an individual job search basis. So if I have to summarize really top line in response to your question, the market is still there. There are no really big changes in absolute terms. The mix among sectors in terms of demand varies quite significantly. And the elephant in the room is really technology. No surprise. The procedures, the recruiting processes, and on the other side of that coin, the job search that deals with these recruiting processes, what I call the talent exchange. I would suggest that technology has, however much it seems like a default and a necessary and occasionally facilitating tool, it's actually led to some less accurate, less productive, and even less efficient consequences for both sides of the exchange. And if you allow, I can kind of describe the situation from three top-line perspectives: supply and demand, the effects on channels, and also, very importantly, the effect on timing. How long it takes an individual doing what he or she had to do under COVID, and how much longer that would have been because of that, as opposed to having done the same thing, let's say, 2-3 years ago. Is that fair? Can I start with sort of general observations on supply?
Absolutely,
demand?
absolutely.
Okay. As I suggested in my remark, not much has really changed. Demand, I think, remains stable, but not all companies have really been affected the same way. So the mix is different, and there will be no surprises here. Hospitality and retail are hurt. Some industries that were hurting before the pandemic, banking, have also been hurt. But conversely, private equity and investment side of banking is actually very robust from what we've seen. Life sciences and fintech are growing. In other words, there are non-significant increases from the sample that I just mentioned that forms the basis of this opinion. So life sciences and fintech are unaffected. They grow. There's a bias to tech-savvy positions. So not surprisingly, if a role requires a candidate to have had experience in dealing with digital, then that's going to be a much easier search than for a position that doesn't require that. It may not even exist. Digital, not surprisingly, very important. There's a focus on digital analytics, even more so than before, and a lot of companies are using the pandemic as a change agent. So if you're going into the market with significant big data analytic experience, your search is going to be a little easier. Not surprisingly, small outfits, faster and more agile to recover and reopen the taps in terms of the talent pursuit than their larger counterparts. It's also important to recognize that the pandemic has created a couple of new opportunities. Again, this doesn't affect the demand function that much, but a lot of jobs are now available that did not exist before because they will accommodate working from home. And some positions that exist are with companies that actually jumped in and saw an opportunity for their business model and became aggressive in the pandemic. But all things put together on the demand side, minor, 5%. But the important point is there's not a significant downturn. Now, on the supply side, this is, I think, very interesting. There's some evidence we've got, again, limited data, that supply may actually be increasing. Why? Not because of redundancies, not because of the headlines that we see, so many layoffs, closures, pubs, hospitality, hotels. That's not the sector that is relevant to this discussion and to our audience. It's not redundancies, but it's because more people are applying for jobs out of insecurity, or in some cases we've seen the flight from the cities. So if you are working in New York and going to move to New Hampshire for personal reasons, and you will look at opportunities that will allow you to work out of New Hampshire. So the pandemic is, to some extent, stimulating a job search on the part of individuals who are currently gainfully employed.
I wonder if it's also just that it's a little bit easier to do a kind of a covert job search if you're working from home.
Absolutely.
And supposed to, you can take a call during the day. You can have your computer open during the day with LinkedIn Jobs or something that you're searching, as opposed to if you're at work, you need to be a little bit more covert about that.
Absolutely. There are, when we get into this in a moment, there are some important advantages that accrue to the job seeker. I would suggest, as a general comment, companies are actually a little worse off in how they recruit people. The job searcher is a little better off in the pandemic about how he or she tries to get a job, for the very reasons that you've explained.
All right. So let's keep going. So you mentioned supply and demand, channels.
Channels. Not surprisingly, again, we're finding what I would call a misdirected interest in or reliance on online because networking immediately seems so difficult. You're not going to set up, a coffee chat with somebody in the other end of town. I have found people, wrongly so in my opinion, are starting their job searches by using online services or channels, notably LinkedIn, which is sort of a near cousin to Zoom. So, as I said earlier, the elephant in the room is technology, and if all interviews are being now conducted by Zoom, then the cousin on the computer is LinkedIn to get to those Zoom interviews. I had one individual, a consultant with a Big Four, reputable name, who applied for 35 LinkedIn opportunities, got only 2 discussions, both of which were significantly under that individual's expectations. And by the way, that is even worse than the standard, what I find, 5% yield rate on job searches that are done online. So I find, unfortunately, people are, in the current climate, working out of home covertly on the side, relying on the computer. But the LinkedIn profile online is no better a channel to an interview than it was before the pandemic. There's also what I find a proliferation of online recruiting solutions providers that create a hurdle or an obstacle for some job seekers. There's the emergence of assessment centers or purveyors of selection processes that will assist an employer in getting more structure and precision into the new video reality. I'm finding many job seekers are encountering an additional step that did not exist as often, and which is a third party that has been brought in to assess the candidate's performance in addition to their company's or the employer's own resources. So that's an interesting, again, a new development. And we've also seen that and it's related to the reliance on online, that artificial intelligence just isn't working. Most notably 3 years ago, well, this predates the pandemic, but Amazon, very notable for its attempts to setting up an ethos or a system or criteria by which to assess candidates. Everyone has to interview in a certain way for Amazon, was also secretly using AI, and it junked it. So companies, the struggle with the pandemic and the intrusion or the reliance on technology, I believe, is more of a problem for the employer than it is for the individual job seeker, the individual candidate. That's just I think, a very interesting observation. Finally, in terms of timing, now this is where I depart from my earlier estimate that all of these changes that we can talk about are in the 5 to 10% amplitude. Job searches are taking, or recruiting processes, but this holds true for both sides. The recruitment of candidates by companies is taking about 25% longer, and concomitantly or conversely, the job seeker is experiencing a 25% increase in the length of his or her activities. In other words, what used to take 4 months before the pandemic will take 5. What used to take for a more senior individual, let's say 6 months, might take 8 months. And the driving determinant behind this slowdown is really 2 things. One is the longer lag, the greater lags in between steps. People do not automatically communicate faster or more accurately in the recruitment of a candidate just because they're doing it all online. They're no longer doing it in the office. So I'll give you an example. Just very recently, a candidate who had signed an offer from a Fortune 500 employer several months ago, discovered, actually last week, that the relocation package that she countersigned and she was offered by the company was actually 2 years out of date. It didn't exist. And they had to then renegotiate the reload package, which came into some, significant 5-digit numbers in terms of dollar value. And the reason for it was that nobody had checked that the reload policy was 2 years out of date. So there are greater lags in the and inaccuracies on the employer side when they're trying to coordinate all of them working out of home in the recruitment of a candidate. But the more significant factor behind the slowdown, again, no surprise, is there are very few, if maybe none, multiple interview days. So before the pandemic, you could be a candidate, the third round, and be invited to visit the employer for a day of interviews, starting at 11 and ending at 5, and you would meet 4 or 5 interviewers. You don't do that anymore when you're doing online recruiting or video recruiting. Generally speaking, those 4 to 5 interviews that would be distributed across 2/3 of a day are now distributed over the next 4 to 6 weeks. Mm. And if you are one of several candidates reaching that round of multiple interviews, then you can imagine how that translates. You'll take 6 weeks to get through a round that would have taken place in one, and then you have to wait for your competitor candidate to take 6 weeks before he or she completes that round. That's the main reason for longer job searches.
Wow, that's very interesting. And that's almost different than I might have guessed, because you'd think, oh, we don't have to coordinate travel schedules. We can just pop people, boom, 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 knock them out by Zoom and get it done. And it's actually different than I'm seeing in the consulting world, in the independent consulting world, where I'm seeing decisions in some cases are happening much faster can happen faster, where someone, will want to get started a consulting project and they'll talk to a candidate and they're starting on Monday, just boom.
And that's a very, very important point, because what we have is a cruel inversion of timing. So the employer is slowing down, but as I pointed out earlier, the benefits of the technology injection and video interviewing and and conducting a job search out of home is actually, in terms of the block and tackle, the execution of steps, providing the individual job seeker a tremendous advantage. You're right. It's more efficient. There's no travel. So I don't have to go to that first meeting face-to-face. I don't have to go to that second meeting. I don't have to go to that 4-person interview. There's no dead time associated with the meetings. It's easier to match the availability between an interviewer and an interviewee in many cases, because you're not dealing with an intermediary, the assistant, the PA. And on the interviewer side, people are stuck at home also, the interviewers, and they're more available. They're not distracted by, the 40% or 50% of their time they spend in staff meetings. They're still having staff meetings with Zoom, but it's no longer as much of an impediment on the scheduling. So the individual job seeker is greatly more efficient, and on the other side, the employer is less so. It's also easier for the individual job seeker to conduct the job search out of home. You can make calls. You can set up a power. You may be gainfully employed, but you can have the entire machine and apparatus set up to conduct the job search. Easier to make calls. Easier to focus on the preparation of interviews, because you've got the 30 minutes in front of the interview. You're not standing in front of the building in order to get in and then waiting in the lobby. You can prepare until the end, the last minute before the actual screen connects on Zoom.
Yeah.
And then what I'm finding out of the survey is a little surprising for me. It'll be interesting how you react to it. Individuals who are in the job market conducting a job search are finding that because of everything that I've just said and you've remarked, first calls are easier to make. It is easier to organize visual or virtual coffee chats because the time investment for both parties to set it up is lower. When you had to set up a coffee chat outside of the employer's office, it required more time investment. It could be weeks. People are saying everybody's at home, and it's very easy to have a meeting scheduled at home. You don't have to go to some, third-party location, separate venue, independently. So there are many advantages accruing from what I call the procedural aberrations that fall on the side of the job seeker. But in contrast to the first call, second calls are more difficult. In other words, how do you convert that initial Zoom video into a referral? Do you really need a second call? The onus, it seems, is to get that second call on video is to drive the value proposition that you express in that first call much more clearly and earlier. So
if you mentioned that you kind of don't think that people should be just jumping right into looking at LinkedIn jobs and so forth and other online sources. Like, that's not your recommended approach for kind of the caliber of candidates that you work with. And we're talking alumni of top tier consulting firms, or
yes,
maybe you're working with sort of transition career coach or job search coach for people that are leaving a top tier consulting firm. What someone comes to you and says, hey, I've never done a search before. It's been years since I did a search. I'm leaving, top tier consulting firm as an engagement manager, a case team leader, or project leader. What's your recommendations on how someone should approach this?
With respect to the pandemic or in general?
Well, maybe a little bit of both. So let's say if someone comes to you today and they're somewhat new to they haven't really done a job search for a while. Maybe they got right out of business school. They got hired into a top tier consulting firm. They've been there for 4 or 5 years, and they haven't really done a search, maybe even since college. And there they were canvas recruiting. So what are some tips that you have on how to approach this, if there's any differences for the pandemic? But what advice are you giving candidates that are coming to you now?
Yeah. The advice actually traverses both the pandemic and the pre-pandemic period. So to some of the listeners who might have heard the first podcast I did with you 2 years ago, I see there's only 3 channels that any individual can use to go from job A to job B, or if the person is unemployed, to go into job A. And that's starting with, in no order of precedence or priority, headhunters or recruiters. Every statistic I've seen in the 3 decades I've been doing this or involved in it in some manner or form suggests that no more than 5% of the connections made between an individual executive, a candidate, and the employer comes from headhunters. It's a much misunderstood, overvalued channel. That's one, and it's about 5%. For your audience, I would argue very strenuously, with great conviction, that it's not going to be more than 5%, or either in the pandemic or before or outside of it. The second channel is online. Online can range anywhere from 5 to 15%. The smaller number, 5% yield on online recruiting. In other words, online is applying for a job that's advertised somehow. Now, online consists of tens of thousands of portals or URLs where resumes meet employers advertise positions. It's a highly automated, easily, seductively simple because you can conduct a job search online at midnight or, from a beach where you're taking a break. But the more senior you are, and I would say if you're going to be if you're going after a job that pays, let's say, over $300,000 in U.S. terms annually, then the 5% of your throughput is going to come from online. If you are under that level, positions, you may get 15% of your yield coming from online postings. I recommend to everyone not to ignore that, just to manage their expectations on online channels. In other words, you can find many great opportunities that exist, which you may assess as not being correct for you, and through that identify an employer that you may be interested in, but not necessarily to apply for that job.
Yeah.
So online is as in the example I made at the very beginning, a senior manager, the person in question was someone earning probably around $400,000 a year at a Big Four.
Yeah.
And applied for 35 jobs.
Yeah, I'll say two things
and,
on
only
go
got
ahead.
Sorry?
Well, I had two things to say on that, Spish. One is, if anybody is applying to jobs on online portals, probably some of the best $100 or $200 that you could spend would be to post a job on that portal to get a perspective from the employer perspective. So if you're applying to jobs on LinkedIn Jobs, go ahead and post a job on LinkedIn Jobs to understand what the platform looks like from the employer perspective and how many responses you get and what they look like. If you're applying to jobs on Indeed, which this audience probably is not so much, go ahead and post a job on Indeed. You can put a daily rate for the job, so you can put a daily spend limit on the job, so you can spend $50 and see what that gets you after one day, and then turn the job off. You've only spent $50. On LinkedIn, it's a daily rate. You can post job with a budget of $10, $20, $30, and just to see what it likes, see the functionality, so you have some empathy and sympathy for what the employer is going through, because you can often get just if you post it on LinkedIn Jobs, you might get 30, 40, 50, 200, 300 candidates, and the only thing that you get is just the person's profile. You're not getting like any kind of a cover letter or anything like that. Yeah. So if you are applying to those jobs, you kind of see that, and then think about reaching out directly to the person who posted it with an email, and then following up 3 or 4 times, because if you're not getting called, it might be not because they don't like you. It's just because there's so
Absolutely.
many that they didn't even look at your profile. And then I think there are probably some specialty forums. Maybe you have a reaction, Spish, but like certainly for McKinsey alums, the McKinsey job portal is very, very good and has like very serious high-end jobs posted there. I don't know about Bain and BCG and other top firms, but some of those might be very highly vetted jobs as well. There's one that I've seen that's pretty good called Exec Thread, where like kind of high-end jobs are posted. So do some research to find out where the jobs in your field that are at your level, if you're going to be spending time responding to online jobs.
You're making some very good points. First of all, my advice to anyone applying in responding to a job, to an advertised position, is not only to write the appropriate cover letter and to send the requested resume, the CV, but even as important, if not more so, launch a parallel outreach to anyone they can find inside that company and develop a parallel conversation. Because the problem with online job postings is that the screening filter at the receiving terminus is woefully inadequate. It's either, I put it semi-comically, a half-informed contract resume reader who is executing or assessing incoming resumes by word count, or an optical scanner, or even an artificial intelligence algorithm that will not find the right will not find the right resume. So if the job is there and you're convinced you're a good candidate, do not rely on the automated channel communication. Launch an outreach to anyone you can find out of your own networking contacts, and let them know, for example, that I've applied for job Alpha.1 version 3. Could I talk to you about that, either to get information or to understand more about the recruiting process and the selection process? To rely merely on an instant response to a job is taking huge risk. You are right that there are, in the huge universe of online of job boards, there are what I call the high value, high filter ones, and the McKinsey one, and equally, to some extent, not as much, the alumni career websites and portals of business schools. And many of the other consultancies are now beginning to develop outreach programs for their alumni, and in some cases, even employers. So there's a growing recognition that as a good policy for business, not just for relations with former employees, it's useful to reach out to former employees and talk and let them know about opportunities. So that trend is growing. But for a senior executive, the chances that even in the McKinsey example you used, that he or she will find 4 to 5 positions on that job board to which he or she can apply, very low. There may be 1 or 2.
Yeah.
And that's not enough.
So what's the third? What's the third channel?
The third channel is the one where statistically, and every study I've seen ranges from 60 to 95% of the opportunity come from networking. In other words, networking is reaching out to people with whom you can have a conversation about your job search. And there's a segmentation to that networking. It's either reach out to somebody to get information, or reach out to somebody to get an introduction or a referral, or reach out to someone who's actually going to be a decision maker about your candidate, about your potential candidacy. And you can reach out to individuals either in what I call a real category. In other words, I know her, she knows me, we once sat in the same training course together 10 years ago or 5 years ago. And it can be a nominal connection. And this is where the power of alumni from some of the top-tier consultancies comes to play. I don't know her, she doesn't know me, but we have 2 things in common. She used to work in my company, I am in that company, or I also used to work in that company, and she is active in a particular segment of the fintech industry, and I am active or interested in that sector. Those 2 commonalities, those shared items, will in most cases create a 60 to 80% response rate.
Yeah.
Even if you don't know that person.
What are your tips on A+, really good outreach? How do you do that outreach to get the person to say yes? To call you back to say yes, I will talk to you. Yes, and there's, I guess, 2 categories. So the one category is someone that they're a weak tie, someone that you have worked with in the past. How do you reach out to that person to ask them if they can help you, give you some help on your job search? And then sort of second question is, how do you reach out to people that you don't know? Hey, I see that we're fellow, Jets fans, or I see that we're fellow alumni of McKinsey or fellow Penn State Nittany Lions or whatever. Yeah. Would you, and I see that you're in the industry that I'm interested in. How do you recommend that you reach out to on LinkedIn or by email or whatever to get the person to be willing to spend time with you on the phone?
Yeah, it's very. There's a couple of hallmarks that dictate the success or the efficacy of such an outreach. So one is brevity. My advice to every job seeker is do not write that letter or that email to have more than 5 sentences in it. The first, it should comprise 3 modules scattered across those traversing those 5 sentences. So the first one, probably not more than if you know that person, not more than a sentence, establishing the relationship. So referring to the previous experience or shared or the commonality. No more than one sentence if you know that person. No more than 2 if you don't, where you establish the shared experience. The second one is the agenda. Why do you want to talk to that person? Explicitly, I would like to talk to you because I am interested in, or I am leaving company A, and I am interested in this company, in your sector or your industry. Be very explicit, be very concrete. And the third one, especially if you're writing to somebody for a referral, would be to codify no more than 2 sentences in what I call your value proposition. Apart from showing and flattering the reader, the recipient of your email, why you're interested in them, is why they should get something out of talking to you. In other words, I have some experience. This is the author of the outreach letter. I have some experience which I believe bears directly on issues that you are facing in the company, and I'm contemplating making a change, from my company to a company like yours, where I could contribute on that basis. So it's who am I? Why am I interested in having this conversation? And if you want to, if you're really addressing a senior executive, is explain to him or her, in very briefly, in 1 or 2 sentences, what you can bring to the party, and then you attach the resume. Do not repeat any aspects of the resume in the actual body of the outreach letter.
Let's say the person says yes. What are your suggestions on the best way to conduct that discussion? Should you try to push to have it as a Zoom? Should you try to do it as a phone call? When the person picks up the phone, like, how do you manage that discussion? And I'll maybe just throw my editorial comment and see if I'm a recipient of a fair number of these, and I try to take as many as I can. And often I find that people start these conversations by just giving me like a 5-minute bio on the phone. Like, let me tell you about like what my life is. And, I left college and I started consulting and I did this and I did this and I did this and I focused on this industry. And they're going on like for 5 minutes. And it's usually not very interesting, to listen to. I guess they're hoping to get something out of me, like I'll send them on. But so I don't think that that's the best approach, but wanted to get your thoughts on what is a really good approach of how to use those calls or those phone calls.
You asked a few questions. So the first one is, after you've written this email, no more than 5 sentences containing 3 different, call it themes or messages, you ask for, could I speak with you? Could I put myself on your calendar for 15 minutes? And the response could be either, okay, fine, we'll have a telephone call, or it could be that the individual replies, says, let's do Zoom, because that contact is already in a world of Zooming. But I'm finding, we can get into this in a moment, that there is a lot of what we know generally is Zoom fatigue. So although people are using Zoom a lot more in their job searches, as I pointed out earlier, especially for employers, the effect of Zoom is not as great as they hope. But back to your question, you're exactly right. You take when you actually have that conversation on the phone. So once you have agreed, because you've responded to a nice, succinct letter explaining why you should give the individual some time on the phone or in Zoom, you want that person to get into the specifics of the agenda. If the person has sent you their resume already, and usefully in the originating letter has explained what the agenda is, then that job seeker should dive right in and not repeat what is already known to you in the resume, because you're going to become very disinterested. I got into this, Will, you might find it interesting, when I was almost 30 years ago, when I was in the United States in the search business, and I would get calls as an alumnus of McKinsey. I would get calls from a lot of people who were leaving McKinsey. And they knew about me because I was I think I was the only headhunter in Washington. And if they were interested in a job in Washington, they would call me and I would take the call. And within 3 minutes, I would ask them politely to dispense with what you just described. I wouldn't let it go 5 minutes and say, okay, fine, I know you're a good person. I know what you're interested in. Tell me how I can help you. And I would drive down to such issues as, are you interested in company A or B? I'll tell you A is good, B is not. In other words, the greatest efficacy of a call like that is to dive quickly into the concrete specificities. Senior executives who are responding like you are responding to an inquiry like that are being essentially charitable, unless, of course, you see something in that individual that makes it worth your while because you want to hire that person or you want to collaborate or it's a potential client. But other than that, it's institutionalized, charity. It's a professional one, and you have a limited amount of time in which you can just listen to somebody without knowing what the purpose is. So diving right into the specificity, the agenda, the goal, the purpose of the call. Once you do that, if you're doing it well and there's a little bit of luck, and there always has to be, then a very nice dialogue will ensue.
One tip that I got from a career coach named Ellis Chase, about almost 15 years ago, was to have a list of companies of interest and to say, like, what do you think of this list? And because it kind of shows you've done your homework, and particularly even if you have a list of companies that you're not interested in. So it makes it very specific. And then the person can say, well, I don't think you should really do company number 6 because the CEO is a jerk, and you should add company number 11 to your list that, I think is really awesome and it's similar to the other ones. Or I could introduce you to the CEO of company number 8. Want to hear your reaction to that idea of actually bringing a list of companies of interest, or are there other tips like that you would suggest as a way to use that time effectively?
Yeah, that's probably the most powerful technique, and that's what I said when I got started in this. When people would call me and I'd ask them what are the companies they're interested in, and I would give them an opinion: who's good, who's bad, have they thought of something else or another company? So that, again, it exemplifies the maxim that you need to trigger a train of association on that concrete basis in which the person you're reaching out to is now going to be entering your groove on your job search. Ask a general question and you're going to get a general answer. Ask a question about culture, you're going to get an answer on culture. The job seeker is misusing the contact that he or she has with that individual. I'd simply say any technique, whether it's a list or a request to discuss what the party that you're calling is thinking about a particular company, or do they know anything about its performance. The best conversations of this kind are those that are driven by specificity, concreteness, and an agenda that is laid out very early.
All right.
Senior executives apply. If you really think about it for the consulting audience here, it's exactly the technique you use when you provide a report to a senior executive. They want the summary. What do you want out of my conversation? What are we going to be talking about in this 15-minute session that we have? Consultants excel in this because more than their corporate counterparts, they're used to providing executive summaries for their clients. So all they have to do is provide an executive summary about themselves and the agenda and the purpose of the discussion.
How do you recommend to your clients that they keep track of all these conversations that they're having? Do you recommend people do something in a spreadsheet like Excel, or use a CRM
Yeah,
system of some type?
spreadsheet. Yeah, it's what I call a tracker. So a tracker consists of listing the names, and you manage the job search like you manage a consulting project. Think of yourself as conducting a new product rollout. You are the product. You're being rolled out into the market. The only difference here is that you are both the head of R&D, you are the product definition, you are the bag-carrying salesman, but most importantly, you segment the customer base and find out who are the decision makers, the information givers, the introducers, the conduits, and so on. So you need a tracker. A spreadsheet is eminently suitable for this. The name, the date on which you called, the date the individual replied, notes on what was first discussed, another column that shows action, what is expected, so that you can track and do it. If you're doing a job search, which, by the way, most job searches include a networking outreach, anywhere from 60 to 100 individuals. You need to keep track of that and remember what is it that you last talked about. That with the individual, you now know you should call or remind that you'd like to talk to him or her 3 weeks later. So recording, keeping good records, especially what is it that you last said, because you want a tone of intimacy, of familiarity, of shared interest. You want to show that in that conversation that you're having today, following up on one you had a month ago, is as warm, hot, as current, and as important, and as detailed as if it were yesterday.
I think, to your point about spreadsheets, if I were doing a search today, probably just because I'm comfortable with the tool, I would use a CRM system. The one I would use is Pipedrive, which is the one I use for my business, because you can track all that stuff with a bit more functionality than even a spreadsheet. It's there may be out there. I'd be surprised if there's not.
There's no doubt. Yeah, well, there are many programs like this.
Yeah.
I don't get into that, but I think clearly super versions of Excel is what you want. The important point is you need to collect data, you need to keep it current, and you need to use it. That will actually be a very critical variable in a successful job search, because a successful job search includes a huge number of contacts. It's also important to keep track of that, to estimate, by just looking at what the response rate is and what you're getting back, is on an empirical basis to see whether some of the targets that you're pursuing are really behaving in the manner that you should. Which companies are coming back sooner? Where are you getting more traction? And why? It's very important, because you can lose perspective on this. It's a very solitary enterprise, a job search. So the tracker is your companion.
I'm curious if you have any tips on job search etiquette that are somewhat pandemic specific. Like, here's one that I have. If you're in a job interview on a Zoom, should you wear a suit?
Yeah. So I've in preparing for this, I've got about 10 tips.
Perfect. Let's hear them.
For what I would call either the outreach or the interview on all of which are now occurring on Zoom. So let me address the interview etiquette, and there's a couple of ideas. Let's start with what you brought up, which is an obvious point. You need to think it's attire. But the obvious point is you really need to think of how you can stand out from other candidates in Zoom. The employer is going to be looking at a lot of individuals, but looking good in person is different than looking good in video. Appearance matters. So the much ignored fact is that when you would go for an interview inside the employer's office. The environment surrounding you was set by the employer or the headhunter's office or the conference room in which the interview is taking place. You now have, if you're being interviewed on Zoom, a chance to influence your surroundings. However, I find that being at home is creating what I call a slippery slope of casual sloppiness. I have seen in my own dealings with individuals where a certain degree of, let's call it professional decorum, is expected, that the backdrop is inconsistent with call it the gravity of the conversation, because everybody's casual, we're all working out of home. But think about your backdrop. Should it have clutter or should it be a clinic? Whatever the backdrop is, it is an additional statement about who you are. Are you going to use something as contrived, in other words, San Francisco Bay Bridge, or will you have just a sheer wall? I have I've advised some of my my clients, that they should close the door. For example, we were talking and there was a white wall, but there was a vertical. It was, to me, a little distracting because it was an open door. Shutting that door eliminated that vertical line. Now, these are small points, Will, but they eventually add to an impression that the Zoom interviewer is forming of you in the same way as in the pre-pandemic world. The typical statement is many interviewers form impressions of the candidates they're going to interview for 45 minutes within the first 2 minutes. So they take a look at, in men's cases, the shoes that you're wearing. Okay. Now, you don't see the shoes that you're wearing on Zoom. However, you are forming an impression about whether the individual is in what I call a naked white shirt, or whether he is with a white shirt with a blue blazer. Very informal. Okay. You can take off the blue blazer. You can avoid the white shirt by maybe putting on a sweater. Think about, it's all in color, so think about the color of your eyes and find some piece of attire that matches the color of your eyes. Light hair, fair skin against a completely white wall is probably not good. Solids, probably better than a pattern. Use different attire for different interviews, because you don't want to be seen with the same, shirt 5 times. One of my clients goes for a run before a video interview, eats a salad, and watches an inspirational TED Talk before the Zoom interview. A female client of mine actually puts on high heels because she feels professional in them, even though the Zoom is not going to show whether she's wearing high heels or not. In other words, it all goes back to my point about you have some control over not only how you appear, but the surrounding environment. And just as in face-to-face interviews or in-person interviews before the pandemic, I always advised my job-seeking clients to say, ask the HR coordinator, what's the dress code? There's no reason why before a scheduled Zoom call you can't ask, what's the dress code? Now, the answer may be, well, we're all casual, we're all working out of home. Yeah, but what does that mean? There's nothing wrong with asking that. Other tips on Zoom interviews: avoid bright lights. Be careful about how you stare at the other person for 45 minutes. Camera angle, frame it, center, don't slouch. Cheat notes that individuals use because they can split the screen and be looking at notes for the interview. I've had feedback showing that many individuals actually see that and they consider it to be a distracting angle in the eyes of the candidate that's being interviewed. So I think there's a lot of work that can be done. Its impact is not that significant, but it does form an impression about you on a Zoom interview, and it is not being, I believe, adequately addressed by candidates.
Yeah,
That's a long answer to your question about Zoom interview preparation, but I think there's a couple of other things. Try to figure out, the difference between a face-to-face interview or an in-person interview and Zoom is that before you went in, you could walk through the corridor. You would sit down and be maybe asked, would you like some water or a cup of coffee or tea? There were these preamble bonding discussions. Zoom drops you from anonymity into a face-to-face confrontation. So think through, in this particular context of the Zoom interview, whether you say something about the technical connection, or if it's not in the same time zone, what's the weather like? Mention how easy the Zoom connection was before getting into this awkward descent into brutal confrontational interview behavior. There is an absence of warming up. As one of my clients said, in face-to-face interviews, it was a lot easier to build some kind of relationship around the coffee cup. But there is no coffee cup that allows you and the interviewer to build any kind of relationship, whether that's for 30 seconds or 3 minutes. So think through how you break that ice. Also think through that if indeed my earlier remarks were that the first calls are easy but second calls are hard, how are you going to put forward your skills that constitute the value proposition to that interviewer in that first interview? Can you maneuver so that you can highlight or at least refer to skills that will be seen by them as worthy of going back to a second round? Other parts on interview preparation, another tip, people tend to ignore this, but not all videos really work. Okay, not all video connections. Prepare a plan B. Get listed with Zoom, Teams, lots of other programs, because not all employers use the same technical platform, and not all of them are as effective.
Yeah, I got one on that where my daughter
be aware of
my daughter's school, right, uses Teams, and every day it's my job to print out my daughter's homework, right, and classwork. So I'm always logged into Microsoft Teams as Veronica Bachman, and I had one client send me a Teams invite, and I didn't realize it till the last minute. So I'm like logging on to this thing as Veronica Bachman, and the school has like prevented the students from turning on their video using Teams. So like I'm logged on as Veronica Bachman. I can't turn my video on, and all the other clients that I was talking to that day, like they all had their video on. So I just felt like such an idiot, right? So I've since addressed that, but it's definitely a good lesson learned to, get your Teams set up, even if you're not normally using Teams, and make sure that you're able to do a WebEx and the other major platforms.
Exactly, because you may be innocent. The fault may be on the employer side who haven't set it up, or it's no one's fault, but your interview is not going to go as well as it could for some third-party failure. There's also another tip, the last one I've got on interview technique, at least on Zoom, is be aware of fatigue. I had a 2-hour Zoom interview with a client, at which point the client, after about a little more than an hour, said, why don't we just shift to audio? Because both of us were tired of staring at each other's faces. The reality is, people are complaining about Zoom fatigue, work-at-home fatigue, and one has to recognize that it could lead to less focus, less attention. So be very clear on your elevator pitch and value proposition to make sure that it gets communicated as early as possible and as clearly, because you don't know at what point the individual on the other side, even though they're staring at you, looking at you, is actually droning off into some degree of insensate indifference. Now more than ever, you need to be succinct and articulate. And if your competence and confidence doesn't come across, because you can't communicate the force of your personality through physical cues that were available as more easily, more visibly in in-person interviews. That's why when I said earlier, the problem is largely for employers informing really accurate evaluations of their candidates. I'll give you one extreme example, but it's true. Remember I said earlier at this discussion that searches are taking longer because the interview of the round of 4 on one day in the employer's office is no longer possible, and it's distributed over the next several weeks. In one case, I had a client who actually had the employer batch 4 interviewers into one screen for one interview. Okay, so the candidate is having a video interview with 4 people in one screen.
That's rough.
Now, so just think through the arithmetic simplistically. You have 4 interviewer hours gathering what I would argue is less than 1 interview hour of information. On the candidate side, the candidate can't really form an opinion as he or she watches 3 of the executives staring blankly either at their notes or skewing their eyes to see the other person on the Zoom video. It may have been driven by the compression of what I would call buy-in, which is a motivator for having panel interviews, but it comes at a huge cost of time as well as accuracy for the employer. This is just another example of a distortion through technology or through Zoom, dependence on Zoom, for the employer.
I want to switch gears a little bit, Spish, and jump all the way to someone getting a job. I've talked to a few executives who have started new roles since the pandemic started, and they've never been in their company's office. They've never met their colleagues face to face. Do you have any tips for your clients who are starting new roles on how to, get into the company culture and be effective early on, given the pandemic and when everybody's working from home?
Yeah, you bring up a very good point. That's despite the success of conducting a job search, the starting is almost as problematic as getting the job. I've had many of my clients who've literally waited weeks to receive the new employer's laptop and to be integrated into their intranet and internet. So some tips. First, be very honest about the issue and tell all the parties with whom you are in a relationship in a new employer that this is very important, so as to get some what I would call sideline videos or telephone conversations. In other words, apart from being connected and being introduced through video and telephone conference calls, make an effort and have the employer respond to have conversations about history, culture. Do the interview on the phone or in Zoom about topics that you normally would by simply sauntering through the halls and corridors of your new employer. It may be awkward. It may appear initially a little uncommon, but I think eventually people recognize the importance of the issue and would respect your request. The second tip is going back to the network. If you secured the job because you were able to talk to 3 to 4 individuals who were in the company or former employees there, go back to your network, go back to the consultants who know that employer as a client, anyone who can provide you information about the operations of that company. Either it's probably not as as possible in the pandemic, but insights into the pre-pandemic culture of the company. You have to do your own culture audit, and you do it either, as I said earlier, in talking with the new employer directly about this to get the history, the stories, the successes, the failures, or get it by talking to people who know the company or have worked at it before. I've got one of my clients who has secured an offer, does not join for another. Well, the lag between acceptance of an offer and was driven largely by pandemic issues, and actually starting was about 4 months. Had biweekly onboarding sessions with the future boss, and purposely asked to talk to other individuals just to understand the company. So rather than going through an in-person 1 or 2 day program of onboarding, where you're escorted around and you visit the factory and so on, you do that and you ask for it. The initiative, it has to be yours. Employers are not necessarily going to be inspired to do that.
Great. Well, Spish, for anyone who wanted to follow up with you on any of the stuff you talked about, or to get your help on a search, where should they reach out?
Where should they reach out?
Yeah, how should people follow up with you online?
My email. Shall I give it to you, or is there some other way of doing that?
Well, we could put your LinkedIn profile in the show notes if people want to reach out to you via
Sure.
LinkedIn.
The LinkedIn profile. I don't know whether I have my. Yeah, they can reach out certainly through LinkedIn or through my email address.
Okay, and if you want, we'll include that in the show notes. Spish, it's been great having you on the show again. Thanks so much for rejoining and sharing your perspective on what searches have been like during the pandemic.
Thanks a lot. I appreciate it. I hope this was helpful.